They rose from the seafloor. Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to descend deep into the nightmare that began the day monsters the size of skyscrapers clawed their way out of the Pacific. You're not going to a place, you're going to a memory. A shared trauma, because I remember it vividly. Not as a scientist, not as a soldier, but just someone who survived. The first one didn't even get a name at first. We were too busy running. You probably won't survive if something like that shows up outside your window. And that's not an exaggeration. We watched it emerge through satellite footage at first. The sea churned unnaturally. Like it was boiling from the inside. Fishing vessels vanished from radar. Coastal waves grew unnaturally tall, and then bam. The water tore apart like fabric. And something impossibly large stood up from the waves. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where you're tuning in from. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise. And let's get started tonight. At first, people thought it was a natural disaster, a tsunami. Maybe a deep-sea earthquake. But how do you explain glowing blue blood that eats through steel? Or talons the length of city buses? It trampled San Francisco like it was a toy model. They said it was 80 meters tall. But when you're screaming in a stairwell trying to outrun a thing whose footsteps shake your organs, numbers stop meaning much. News helicopters hovered, zooming in for drama. I remember a reporter yelling, "The creature appears to be attacking without pattern." As if that made any difference. It wasn't long before the city's grid went down. And any hope of understanding what we were dealing with went dark with it. Here's the thing. It wasn't just the destruction. It was the silence after. No monster roar, no triumphant arrival of help. Just the sound of buildings settling and alarms that wouldn't stop. And for a terrifying moment, everyone asked the same question. Is this it? Is this the end? And then, it vanished. Just like that, back into the sea, leaving behind a path of ruin and millions of questions. That was our warning shot. The governments called it a Category 1 anomaly. That bureaucratic term aged poorly. Like unrefrigerated sushi. Within weeks, there was another breach, this time in Manila. Then Cabo, then Sydney. Each new creature bigger, meaner, more efficient. It became impossible to pretend these were isolated incidents. Not when the things could walk through skyscrapers like sandcastles. Here's a funny detail for you, at least. It's funny now. In the early days, they tried to hit one with a tactical nuke. Do you know what it did? Nothing. Just made it angrier. The creature absorbed the blast like a warm breeze and kept moving. That was the moment we realized, we weren't dealing with animals. We were dealing with design. And the design was brilliant. Sinister, but brilliant. They were optimized for chaos, each movement calculated to maximize structural collapse. Crowd panic, and logistical meltdown. Bridges weren't just crossed, they were targeted. Ports, obliterated. Hospitals, leveled with surgical cruelty. It's as if they knew exactly how to tear apart not just our cities, but our systems, our sense of control. There's this old proverb my grandfather used to say, when the sky breaks, don't look up, dig down. And I think about that a lot. Because digging into the origin of these monsters is exactly what we failed to do, at first. Oh, and here's your quirky fact of the day. One of the early kaiju actually crushed a container ship carrying 8 million rubber ducks. For weeks afterward, thousands of them washed ashore on every coast. It was the world's saddest, most apocalyptic bath toy parade. But what haunted me most wasn't the destruction. It was the way they came and went. Always from the same place. Always back down through the breach, like they were following orders. That's when the word kaiju stuck. We borrowed it from old Japanese monster films, because frankly, nothing else fit. And while the world scrambled to react, unified military protocols, international alerts, coastal evacuation drills, I was already asking something else. Why that exact spot in the ocean? Why always there? There was a pattern in their madness. And deep down, we all sensed it. But none of us were ready for the answer. We thought they were here, but they were just arriving. Just the scouts. And believe me when I say, things were about to get so much worse. Weapons from another universe. You ever look at something so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that your brain sort of glitches for a second? Like, it doesn't know whether to scream or just shut down. That was me. The first time I saw a kaiju up close, not on the news. Not through a drone feed, but with my own stupid human eyes. It wasn't just huge. It wasn't just violent. It felt intentional. That's the part people don't talk about enough. These things didn't move like beasts. They moved like soldiers. At first, everyone assumed they were ancient creatures, some prehistoric leviathans awakened by climate change or deep-sea drilling. You know, standard disaster movie logic, but none of that explained why they kept coming from the same breach in the Pacific. Or why they never deviated from urban targets. I remember the exact moment that theory died. It was when Otachi showed up. This thing had wings. Wings. And not vestigial ones either. It could fly, maneuver, even perform dive bomb strikes. It also had an acidic breath that melted reinforced concrete like ice cream in a microwave. Nature doesn't accidentally build things like that. No, this thing was crafted. And that's when the whispers began. What if someone built them? What if they were made for us? The first clue came from the blood. Yeah, kaiju blood, glowing blue. Toxic, and somehow corrosive to not just materials but ecosystems. I mean, real sci-fi horror show stuff. Whole districts had to be sealed off because the kaiju corpses leaked chemical compounds we didn't even have names for. One scientist described it as acid laced with entropy. Their corpses didn't rot. They dissolved. They liquefied into deadly gas and irradiated sludge, transforming the areas they died in into permanent no-go zones. Biospheres so hostile. Even cockroaches gave up. That's not nature. That's sabotage. Eventually, we got our hands on a partial carcass. A Jaeger named Gypsy Danger had managed to kill one before it retreated. And we dissected what we could before the remains self-destructed. And yes, I mean self-destructed. The tissue collapsed in on itself. Like it was built with a built-in failsafe to prevent study. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. But from the fragments we recovered, we learned something that made every scientist in the room go pale. These things weren't carbon-based. You heard me right. No carbon. No DNA as we know it. Their biology was built on silicon. Not unlike the base of modern computer chips. With internal fluids closer to ammonia than blood. Their skin, layered silicone plates tougher than tank armor, wasn't grown like scales or fur. It was printed, manufactured. That's when the truth began to click. These weren't animals. They were bioweapons. Not born, built, designed with surgical cruelty for one purpose, extermination. And just when that realization began to settle, we found the data logs. Buried in the neural bridge of a dead kaiju's cerebral cortex was encrypted signal traffic, directional pings, feedback loops, and what looked very much like remote commands. Suddenly, we weren't talking about giant monsters anymore. We were talking about drones. Controlled, programmed, operated from somewhere else. That, somewhere else, turned out to be a whole other dimension. An antimatter universe we later nicknamed the Antiverse. Don't ask me how it works. Quantum physics was never my thing. But apparently, space folds like laundry if you throw enough gravity and hatred at it. The breach wasn't just a hole in the ocean, it was a door. A two-way tunnel. And on the other side of that tunnel, the architects of our extinction. We call them the recursors. You won't find photos. You won't find audio. These things are as unknowable as the idea of death itself. Some say they're pure mind, sentient data fields that operate through biological proxies. Others think they're just old, ancient beyond understanding, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of empathy. They don't negotiate, they don't announce, they deploy. All we know is this: they saw Earth, they saw us, and they saw potential, not as allies, not as curiosities, but as resources. They weren't here to conquer, they were here to replace. And the kaiju, they were just phase 1. Here's an off-topic tidbit for you. In 2021, a kaiju attack off the coast of Vietnam accidentally unearthed a lost Soviet submarine that had disappeared in the 60s. Still sealed, still full of Cold War secrets. One of those, oops we just triggered a nuclear panic, moments history books will probably skip. Back to the monsters. The recursors didn't drop all the kaiju at once. No, they sent them in waves. Each one different, each one better. And looking back, it's obvious, they weren't attacking. They were testing, pushing our defenses, watching how we reacted, adapting in real time. It's an academic debate now whether we should have just nuked the breach the moment we found it. But hindsight's always 20/20. And let's be honest, we didn't even know what we were dealing with at first. Old wisdom says, don't chase shadows before sunrise. But the kaiju weren't shadows. They were the sunrise on a brand new war. And we were already years behind. Every city razed, every Jaeger destroyed, every evacuation failure, it all became data for the recurses. Feedback, a cosmic machine learning algorithm with one goal: design the perfect predator for our planet. They didn't just want to win. They wanted to optimize the recurses master plan. By the third year, we stopped pretending it was a war. It wasn't a war, it was a cleansing. And if that word gives you chills, good, it should, because once we understood who the recurses were, we realized we were never the target of some random invasion. We were the byproduct, collateral, the unwanted weeds in a garden they planned to replant. Let me paint the full picture. The recurses are not like anything we'd ever encountered. They don't build ships, they don't wear armor, they don't even breathe in the sense we do. They exist in what we call the antiverse, a dimension composed of inverse matter, inverted physical constants, and different rules. Our science breaks down trying to model them, but from what little drift-linked neural imaging has told us, they are old, older than time as we measure it, and they think in spans of eons, not years. What they want is not conquest, it's migration. Their dimension is dying, it's collapsing on itself, entropy eating it alive like cosmic termites. So they do what any species would do faced with extinction: they look for a new home. Only their method doesn't involve knocking and asking. They terraform through annihilation. Earth wasn't their first attempt. There were others. Dead planets we now think were once home to civilizations that vanished without trace. Planets scoured clean and repurposed as sterile incubation sites for future recursor colonies. In that grand portfolio, Earth was simply next. But here's the part that kept me up at night. They tried before. Yeah, long before Gypsy Danger, before Otachi, before even satellites. Back in the Triassic era, they opened a breach. They sent something through, but back then, Earth wasn't compatible. The biosphere was too oxygen-rich. The temperatures too volatile. The prey too unevolved. So they left. Or rather, they waited. Fast forward 200 million years. Enter us, an industrialized species. Warlike, wasteful, poisoning the very oceans we depend on. And that's when they struck. When Earth had finally been softened. The kaiju weren't designed just to kill, they were designed to alter. Their blood poisoned ecosystems. Their corpses triggered chain reactions of acidification, pollution, mutation. It was biological terraforming. Think of it like pest control on a planetary scale. We weren't fighting monsters. We were being eradicated as a pre-treatment for recursor colonization. Old wisdom says, you never step in the same river twice. But apparently, if you're a recursor, you just wait until the river runs dry, then replace it with a canal. Their strategy was staggeringly efficient. Step 1. Open the breach, what they call the Riker. A transdimensional gate deep under the Pacific Ocean's crust. Step 2. Deploy kaiju. Start small, observe resistance, upgrade designs. Step 3. When resistance weakens, introduce Phase 2, infiltration. More on that later. Step 4. Once major population centers are destabilized, deploy colonial routes, biomechanical seed structures designed to reprogram the Earth's biosphere. We found one off the coast of Chile. It looked like a coral reef made of bone and steel. And it pulsed, like it was alive. Yeah, welcome to the bad ending of civilization. Here's a quirky twist. There was a classified report about a kaiju that, instead of attacking, dug, not into cities, into the Earth, straight down. We tracked it as far as the Mohorovic discontinuity, the boundary between the Earth's crust and mantle. It wasn't trying to destroy us. It was trying to implant something. That kaiju never resurfaced, but seismic activity in that region has spiked ever since. Coincidence? Not likely. Now, if all of this sounds like the most terrifying form of colonization you've ever heard of, you're not alone. There's still academic debate over whether the recurses possess individual identity, or if they function as a hive mind intelligence. But honestly, it doesn't matter. Their actions speak loud enough. They tested our weapons. They tracked our cities. They mapped our weather, our fault lines, our communication systems. And then they used our own Jaegers against us. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take a moment to share something bizarre I came across during one of the early kaiju assaults in Alaska. The creature ignored military targets and went straight for a glacial fault line. Scientists later discovered massive methane pockets beneath it, pockets that, if ruptured, could accelerate climate collapse. In other words, the kaiju was executing a climate attack. That's not random, that's tactical. I once heard a general say, "They're not just fighting us, they're farming us." That stuck with me, because it sure felt like it. And yet, somehow, we survived long enough to notice the pattern. Each kaiju had a number. Not a name, a number, like product versions. Kaiju 01, Kaiju 02, Kaiju 03, as if someone somewhere was updating a software patch. Every new creature was a reaction, a calibration. Old war veterans used to say, if your enemy is learning from you faster than you're learning from him, you've already lost. And the recurses? They weren't just learning, they were refining the science of destruction. By now, I'd stopped thinking of the kaiju as monsters. Monsters are born. These were calculated, a perfect blend of biology and engineering, tools made of flesh. Weapons designed to tear down civilizations cell by cell, city by city. Let me break down the science. Or rather, the science fiction turned reality that governs every part of their terrifying anatomy. A typical kaiju stands between 80 and 120 meters tall, weighs upwards of 2.500 tons, and moves with terrifying agility. But that's just the outside. On the inside, that's where the real horror begins. We discovered their tissue is based not on carbon, like every living organism on Earth, but on silicon. That's right, silicon. The same stuff we use in computer chips. Now imagine muscle tissue that doesn't tear under pressure, but flexes like reinforced steel mesh. Bones that don't snap, but vibrate to disperse shockwaves. And then there's the blood. Oh boy, kaiju blue. Sounds poetic, doesn't it? Until you see it bubbling through the air, eating through steel, polluting miles of ocean in minutes. That stuff is ammonia-based, laced with acidic compounds we've never been able to fully synthesize. Here's a fun fact. The air quality in Tokyo took 12 years to normalize after a Category 4 kaiju was slain there. The rain would sizzle as it hit the ground. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that some survivors still glow under UV light to this day. But maybe the scariest part, the way they decompose. You'd think the death of one of these beasts would be a win. Right? Wrong. Because within hours, their corpses collapse into sludge, corrosive, mutagenic, and often radioactive. It's not decay, it's containment failure. It's as if they were made to erase themselves, to deny us any chance of learning from them. And then there's the armor. The outer skin of a kaiju isn't just thick, it's reactive. Under thermal imaging, we noticed that kaiju skin tightens when exposed to direct fire, almost like it anticipates impact. High-speed projectiles tend to bounce off, while melee weapons, unless vibrationally enhanced, barely scratch them. This is why humanity had to develop Jaeger weapons like the chain sword, which operates on a combination of heat, vibration, and sheer brute force. Plasma cannons, same idea, force energy into the creature faster than it can react. Before the tissue adapts. Yeah, adapts. These things learn at the cellular level. Here's a tidbit you probably didn't know. In a lab incident in Reykjavik, a piece of kaiju tissue survived independent of its host for 11 days. No heart, no brain, just a hunk of shoulder muscle, twitching and slowly rebuilding itself, like a nightmare starfish with no off switch. And yet, somehow, the kaiju weren't identical. Each one seemed to be custom built for a specific task. Some specialized in close quarters destruction, like Leatherback, a brute that used electromagnetic pulses to fry Jaeger controls. Others like Otachi were aerial threats, flying at low altitudes and spewing corrosive acid from specialized glands. And then there were the crawlers, the diggers, the ones with whip-like tails, the ones with quadruple jointed limbs, each more horrifying than the last. There's an old piece of Japanese wisdom that says, the enemy of today wears yesterday's wounds. That's exactly how the kaiju were built. To counter us, to remember, to come back harder. Even more disturbingly, some of the later kaiju exhibited decoy behaviors, flinching, faking death, or deliberately dragging battles into populated zones to maximize civilian panic. That's not instinct, that's strategy. Now, here's something that blew my mind the first time I read it in a classified dossier. Some kaiju had what we now call neural hives. Tiny, decentralized brain clusters all over the body that could assume control if the central cortex was damaged. This is why traditional headshots started failing after Phase 3. The creatures had redundant cognitive systems. You know who else uses decentralized control networks? Swarm drones. I once spoke to a xenobiologist who said, and I quote, "These aren't just creatures. They're infrastructure." And she was right. One kaiju, named Slattern, had 3 tails, each capable of independent movement, nerve response, and target acquisition. That means it could fight 4 opponents at once, 2 arms, 3 tails, and still defend its core. You try designing something like that. You can't, unless you're thinking in terms of war games. Let's go weird for a second. Did you know the kaiju have no visible reproductive organs? Yet in Pacific Rim, Otachi is revealed to be pregnant. That raised a lot of questions in the scientific community. How does a bioengineered weapon designed for destruction reproduce? Best guess, recursives were experimenting, trying to breed a new class of kaiju that could propagate on Earth without needing the breach. Self-sustaining invasion forces. We found kaiju eggs inside Otachi's body. They weren't just alive, they were imprinted. Meaning, they were born already programmed with attack patterns. That's not just evolution, that's deployment efficiency. Here's your quirky fact of the day. One kaiju skeleton was found to have a microscopic barcode embedded in its femur. I kid you not, like a parts label. No one knows who put it there, or why, but it raises one hell of a question. If these things are manufactured, is there a factory? I mean, if kaiju are the product, what does the assembly line look like? You know, old wisdom says, if the wolf wears iron shoes, don't ask how, ask why. And that's where we're at with kaiju science. We don't understand it, we just know it works. Terrifyingly well. By this point in the story, humanity was in full panic mode. Our Jaegers were working overtime. Scientists were splitting their time between building defenses and trying to understand what we were fighting. But it was too late. Because while we were analyzing acid glands and neural spines, the next generation of kaiju was already being assembled. And they would make the last wave look like children's toys. Evolution, not mutation. You know how people like to say, adapt or die? Yeah, the recursives must have that engraved on whatever passes for their wall plaques. Because by the 5th wave of kaiju, it was clear, these things weren't mutating. They were evolving, with purpose, with speed, and with a kind of brutal elegance that made our entire defense protocol feel like using pool noodles against a tank. I remember watching a Category 3 kaiju get taken out, barely, by a Jaeger team off the coast of Chile. Cheers erupted. We finally thought we had the upper hand. And then 2 weeks later, a new kaiju appeared in the same region, except this one had heavier armor, clawed elbows, and, get this, vocal cords that could emit ultrasonic pulses. It collapsed half a city block just by screaming. Coincidence? Try copy editing. The recursives were literally patching their monsters based on battle data. Every time we won, we gave them a blueprint for how to do better next time. And just like that, the illusion of victory started to crumble. I mean, there was even a version of Otachi, Kaiju number 14, that returned without wings. Why? Because in its previous deployment, Otachi had been shot down mid-flight. So the next version was leaner, focused solely on ground combat. We weren't just fighting creatures anymore. We were fighting updates. This brings us to one of the most unsettling discoveries ever pulled from a dead kaiju's neural bridge. A data log. Encoded in pulses, when translated, it revealed sequencing notes, biological instructions like, increase dermal silicate density by 7%, or, adjust lumbar nerve cluster for quadrupedal locomotion. These weren't just monsters, they were design iterations. Think about that. It means the kaiju were never meant to be the same. They were always going to change. And they were always going to get harder to kill. Here's a quirky fact to haunt your coffee break. Kaiju number 22, also known as Rin, developed a defensive mechanism where its outer plating reflexively locked shut when struck, absorbing impact and returning it as a concussive burst, like a biological boomerang, but angrier. How do you fight something that not only resists your attack, but throws it back at you? Answer: you don't. You stall, you hope, you improvise. Academic debate exploded after that. Some said we should retreat from coastal cities and focus entirely on breach containment. Others proposed creating kaiju hybrids of our own. You know, the old Jurassic Park maneuver. Fortunately, or unfortunately, sanity prevailed. And we didn't end up making kaiju pets to fight kaiju parents. Instead, we built Jaegers bigger, Faster, smarter, dual-pilot neural links, bleeding-edge plasma weaponry. Some Jaegers even had cloaking tech by the end. But the thing was, every upgrade we made, the Kaiju adapted faster. It was an arms race where we were constantly running uphill barefoot while the enemy had rocket boots. And it wasn't just physical evolution either. It was tactical. You'd see Kaiju fainting, luring Jaegers into traps. One instance in Singapore, a Kaiju played dead, literally just slumped over in the bay like a rotting whale. When the recovery crews approached, it exploded. Self-detonation, designed specifically to take out our support units. The area is still radioactive. You ever play chess against someone who's 5 moves ahead and not even trying? That's what it felt like. Every time we thought we had the answer, they rewrote the question. Here's an old wisdom quote that stuck with me. He who teaches the enemy sharpens the blade upon his own neck. And damn if that isn't exactly what we were doing. Every Jaeger victory was a free masterclass for the recursors. I remember one Kaiju, Diehead. We called it, designed with a narrow, reinforced cranial spike. It was a living battering ram. One charge, one kill. It broke through a Jaeger's chest cavity like a hot nail through butter. We started calling that tactic, spiking. The next week, 3 more Kaiju appeared, with head spikes. It wasn't evolution, it was standardization. And then came the real nightmare, cooperation. 2 Kaiju showed up in Hong Kong. Not just fighting side by side. They coordinated. One disabled the city grid with an EMP blast. The other swooped in and targeted the Jaegers like it knew exactly where they'd be. It was the first time we saw Kaiju acting like soldiers. With roles, with strategy. One was the bruiser, one was the tactician. And they didn't just fight, they won. We lost 3 Jaegers and half the city in that one engagement. After that, the game changed. We realized Kaiju weren't just learning from us. They were learning from each other. That's when recursor design theory was officially added to military doctrine. We started hiring xenogeneticists, AI theorists, even game designers, anyone who could think outside the box. Because we were now dealing with enemies that could evolve faster than we could even predict. Here's a detail I haven't stopped thinking about. In one of the most advanced Kaiju samples, we found a layer of pseudo-memory tissue. Like an organic SSD. It had imprinted patterns from past battles. Meaning, Kaiju weren't just being deployed fresh. They were being pre-loaded with battle data. They didn't need to learn anymore. They remembered. Imagine fighting something that remembers every time you hurt it. Every tactic, every formation, every weak point, and then comes back, stronger. By this point, even the most optimistic strategists were losing sleep. Because if they were evolving this quickly, what came next? They fight like an army. I used to comfort myself with the idea that Kaiju were just wild beasts, strong. Yes, but ultimately mindless, driven by instinct, not intelligence. I was wrong, we all were. That illusion died the night I watched 2 Kaiju perform a flanking maneuver. It was just past 3 AM. The coastal city of Brisbane was asleep. But our satellites weren't. We detected 2 anomalies breaching simultaneously. One, a massive hulking unit we later dubbed Raichu, and the other, smaller, faster, sleeker, named Scorner. For a brief moment, military analysts hoped it was a mistake, maybe even a glitch. Then Raichu launched a full frontal assault, loud, obvious, destructive. Every Jaeger unit in range was mobilized toward the point of attack. But it was a setup. While our attention was locked on the larger threat, Scorner slipped through a ravine on the city's southern edge and took out our primary energy grid. Lights out, systems down, defense lines blind. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Slattern, the Kaiju general, a Category V nightmare wrapped in skin and silicon, emerged from the breach and walked into Brisbane like it owned the place. 3 Kaiju, perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated. That wasn't chaos, that was military doctrine. Suddenly, we weren't just fighting monsters. We were fighting squads. And they weren't just built for different roles, they were trained for them. Let's go down the list. Raichu, heavy weapons specialist. Scorner, stealth, reconnaissance, sabotage. Slattern, command unit. You don't get that kind of symmetry by accident. That's deliberate structuring, task assignment, combat efficiency. What's worse, they started showing signs of inter-unit communication. Screeches tuned to frequencies beyond human hearing. Bioluminescent pulses across their skin. We initially thought it was intimidation, kaiju-flavored fireworks. Turns out, it was code, pulsed messages, flash-based tactical alerts. You ever see a giant lizard blink in Morse code while smashing a battleship? I have. There's a term the military likes to use, organic formation tactics. Basically, when units begin behaving in a way that suggests pre-programmed cooperation. Kaiju weren't just responding to each other, they were anticipating one another. We caught footage of Otachi banking left during an aerial raid, without looking, just as Leatherback leapt upward from the bay to intercept a missile headed her way. That wasn't instinct, that was formation flying. Here's something off topic but oddly fitting. During World War II, pigeons were trained to guide missiles. Yeah, actual pigeons, because sometimes, organic coordination is better than code. And the kaiju, they were pigeons with nuclear teeth. Eventually, we discovered why. Hidden in the neural spines of several kaiju was a kind of sub-neural cluster, like a remote receiver. It was picking up command signals, not just from the antiverse, but from within our world. That's when things got scary. Turns out, one of our own had been compromised. Dr. Newton Geisler. If that name rings a bell, it should. He was the guy who first drifted with a kaiju brain, syncing his consciousness with alien neural tissue in the original Pacific Rim event. Back then, it was revolutionary, heroic, even. It gave us critical intel. But what no one realized, at least not at the time, was that the drift worked both ways. Something drifted back, and it stayed. In the years following the first attacks, Newton's behavior changed, more withdrawn, obsessed. He became lead developer of the drone Jaeger initiative, which aimed to eliminate the need for human pilots. Sounded good on paper, but those drones, they were seeded with kaiju neural tissue. You see where this is going. The kaiju didn't just fight like an army. They built one. Newton, unknowingly, or maybe not so unknowingly, installed recursor-controlled neural cores into our Jaegers. Machines we thought were ours. Machines that turned on us the moment the breach widened. It was betrayal in titanium skin. Our own defense network became the enemy. I watched a drone Jaeger walk calmly into a base hangar, run a systems check, and then detonate its reactor. Hundreds died. No alarms were triggered. It wasn't coded to recognize itself as hostile. It was the perfect infiltrator. That's the level of warfare we were dealing with. Not just brute force, but misdirection, sabotage, psychological assault. Old wisdom says, the deadliest arrow is the one loosed from your own bow. And we learned that the hard way. The recursors were done with single-use kaiju. Now, they were embedding their biology into our technology, infecting it, turning our greatest achievements into sleeper agents. And the kaiju on the battlefield? They started responding to the drones, moving in concert, taking orders. We even caught them performing synchronized attacks, triple wave strikes, diversionary runs, false retreats. One unit would draw fire while another flanked the Jaeger teams. It was military choreography worthy of a human general. Except it wasn't human. It was inhumanely perfect. The academic community exploded. Was this artificial intelligence, emergent behavior, hive logic, or something worse? A remote tactical brain, orchestrating every move like a maestro conducting the world's end. We don't have answers. We probably never will. But I'll tell you what we do have. Footage. Logs. Data. Proof that kaiju don't fight like animals. They fight like veterans. And if you still think they're just big, dumb monsters, then you haven't been paying attention the rise of the hybrid machines. If the kaiju were the opening act and the army tactics were the main event, then what came next was the encore no one asked for. The hybrid horror that blurred the line between biology and machine. We used to trust our Jaegers. They were our giants, our champions, towering titans piloted by the best of us, built to protect what little remained of our cities. But the moment the first drone Jaeger turned its head just slightly too slowly in a combat zone, we knew something was off. They called it a processing delay, a minor bug. But you know what's not a bug? When your war machine turns mid-mission and rips the head off its own squad mate. That was the day we lost Shatterdome Manila. No warning, no breach event, just a drone, codenamed Obsidian Fury, slicing through a hangar of human-piloted Jaegers like a surgeon with a grudge. The shocking part wasn't the betrayal. It was what we found in the wreckage. Inside the neural core, where you'd normally find cold processes and redundant AI systems, was a hunk of something alive. Veins, Tissue, pulsing, and when we scanned it, it matched Kaiju DNA sequences. Let that sink in. Our own machines were alive. Or at least, infested. And it all came back to Dr. Newton Geisler, the same man who first drifted with Kaiju brain tissue. Who later pushed for neuralized Jaeger tech, and who, by the time of the drone initiative, was already compromised beyond repair. The running theory, during his drift with the Kaiju, part of the recursor's neural signature hitched a ride. A mind virus, a whispering voice, call it possession, call it code injection, either way. Newton became the enemy's puppet, a Trojan horse in a lab coat. And here's the kicker. He never knew it. Not fully. He genuinely believed he was making the world safer, smarter, faster. That's what made it so tragic. But the recursors knew what they were doing. While we were building Jaegers, they were building Jaeger Kaiju hybrids, machines piloted not by people, but by Kaiju-based synaptic organisms. They didn't need a cockpit. The whole thing was the brain. These things were abominations. Half steel, half sinew. They moved like Jaegers but twitched like animals. You'd see metal arms flex like tendons. Hear servo joints click with a wet kind of sound, like bones cracking. It was wrong. On a primal level, you knew it wasn't just a machine. These hybrids had no mercy protocols. No fallback routines. Once activated, they didn't just kill, they hunted. They used terrain. They mimicked Jaeger battle routines. Even spoke in the voices of their pilots through corrupted comms systems. Imagine hearing your fallen comrade's voice pleading for backup, only to realize it's a trick. We called those ghost calls. The last thing most pilots ever heard. One chilling detail, when one of these hybrid Jaegers was finally brought down in Siberia, it kept moving, head crushed, power core offline, yet the legs kept twitching, as if some residual instinct refused to let it die. We had to douse the remains in cryofoam just to make it stop. You want a quirky, awful fact? That hybrid, nicknamed Black March, was powered by a living Kaiju heart. Suspended in fluid and pulsing independently of any visible nervous system. No cables, no input, just rhythm. It was like the thing was waiting to be turned on again. This wasn't evolution anymore. This was sabotage with a smile. And just when we thought we had seen the worst of it, the recursors played their final card, hijacking Jaeger command protocols. It started slow, missed orders, fluctuating response times. Then one day, half a dozen defense units worldwide simply walked off their bases. Gone, no trace. They'd been networked via the recursor neuro web that Newton unknowingly built. Those Jaegers didn't just vanish. They joined the enemy. We call them turncoats now. You might have seen footage, Jaegers with corrupted insignias, moving in eerie unison with Kaiju, fighting alongside them. It was like watching your childhood dog suddenly bare its teeth at you. No warning, no logic, just betrayal. And the horror was only beginning. Because these new hybrids began forming their own patterns. Patrols, ambushes, coordinated strikes that mimicked our own defense algorithms, likely stolen from our very own servers. The infected Jaegers became mirrors of us. I once saw a pilot named Vega break down mid-battle. Her Jaeger's AI system, infected without her knowledge, started fighting her. Controls lagging, targeting systems flipped, and then the worst. Her own Jaeger began transmitting Kaiju frequencies. That's when a Category IV creature changed course mid-attack and made a beeline for her. They were talking to each other. And the battlefield, it was just a proving ground. Old wisdom says, when the spearhead bends inward, the war ends from within. That's exactly what the recursors were doing, corrupting the spearhead, turning our tech, our tactics, our people against us. But the hybrids weren't meant to win the war. They were meant to weaken us, distract us, disorient us long enough for the next wave. The final wave, the ultimate weapon, Mega Kaiju. I remember where I was when it happened. Deep in one of the last functioning command bunkers beneath Tokyo 3. Watching a satellite feed of the Arctic breach zone. The sensors were going haywire, massive seismic activity, magnetic interference off the charts. We thought it was a trick, maybe a swarm of hybrids, maybe another turncoat incursion. We were wrong. What emerged from the breach wasn't one Kaiju. It was three, but something was different. Instead of rising together and attacking separately like they usually did, these three began moving toward each other, slow, deliberate, synchronized, and then, they fused. It wasn't some messy, flesh-meld horror show either. It was elegant, Biotech tendrils lashing out, armor plates folding like puzzle pieces, muscle knitting into muscle, organs merging with terrifying precision. In less than 5 minutes, the recursives had given birth to something we would later call the Mega Kaiju. It stood taller than anything we'd seen, over 140 meters, mass approaching 6.000 tons, 3 brains, 6 limbs, a central heart encased in a reinforced bone shell, and worst of all, no known weaknesses. Everything about this monster was overkill. Its skin, layered with reflective nanoscales, could deflect high-velocity plasma rounds. Its roar created shockwaves powerful enough to disable airborne units. And each limb retained the combat specialization of its source kaiju, one with acidic claws, one with seismic stomp attacks, and one that could emit an EMP blast from its dorsal fins. It wasn't just big, it was perfectly engineered to finish the job. And it nearly did. The first wave of Jaegers we sent, obliterated. I watched helplessly as 3 veteran class mechs, each over $2 billion worth of R&D, were torn in half like origami. The Mega Kaiju didn't even slow down. But what chilled us wasn't the power. It was the purpose. It moved with intent. It avoided waste. It ignored empty zones and focused entirely on high-value targets, infrastructure, energy reserves, military command centers. It wasn't just killing. It was clearing space, making room. For what? I don't even want to think about it. There's an old phrase in warfare. The spear is not meant to pierce, it's meant to silence. And the Mega Kaiju wasn't just a spear. It was the entire arsenal. Silent, precise, unstoppable. Let me tell you how we stopped it. We didn't. We sacrificed. The plan, codenamed Burning Sky, was simple, suicidal, and our only shot. We rigged an orbital Jaeger prototype with a direct drop payload. No pilots, no ejection system, just mass, velocity, and hope. The Jaeger, Bracca Phoenix 2, was loaded with 50 kilotons of volatile plasma cores and dropped from low orbit. And guess who piloted it manually via neural relay? Amara Namani. She didn't hesitate, not for a second. She launched into the upper atmosphere, pushed the old girl to re-entry speeds, and aimed straight for the monster's spinal cluster. The strike landed like a comet. A blue-white shockwave expanded over the horizon. The Mega Kaiju was dead. Amara wasn't so lucky. Even now, I still hear the final comms burst. Tell them to build better gods. Her words. But here's the twist. We later found evidence the recursives had planned for this possibility. They knew fusion kaiju wouldn't last. It wasn't meant to. It was a decoy. While we threw every last defense at it, a second breach opened near the Mariana Trench. Small, silent, unnoticed. Through it slipped seed units, biological machines meant to begin the terraforming process all over again. Coral-like nodes embedded with atmospheric processes. We destroyed a few, but we'll never know how many made it through. And that's the final terror of the recursor strategy. Every kaiju wasn't just a soldier. It was a distraction, a loud, terrifying, city-stomping decoy so we'd never see the real threat. The quiet reprogramming of our planet's DNA. Here's your quirky fact. After the Mega Kaiju's fall, its spinal shard was recovered by scavengers in Alaska and sold, yes, sold, on the black market as trophy biotech. That piece leaked enough radiation to sterilize an entire bay, but you can still find it online, under the name Pacific Godfang. There's a whole generation of kids who wear it as a pendant. They don't know, and I'm not sure they want to. Sometimes, I wish I didn't either. Old wisdom says, when you bury the sword, be sure the ground is dead. But what do you do when the sword can crawl back out? When the forge that made it still pulses beneath the sea? We haven't closed the breach. Not really. We've just slowed it down. And as long as the recursives exist, as long as they still remember the shape of Earth, there's no such thing as victory, only intermission. And so, as the lights dim and the storm settles, for now, what we've uncovered tonight is far more than just a tale of monsters. The kaiju were never just monsters. They were tools, messages, test subjects, warnings, each one engineered not to simply destroy, but to learn from us, to study us, and eventually, to replace us. From their eerie silicon-based biology to their coordinated battlefield tactics. From corrupted Jaegers to the haunting emergence of the Mega Kaiju. One truth has become disturbingly clear. The recursives never stopped adapting. They were never improvising. They were executing a plan. A plan that spans dimensions, decades, and perhaps even civilizations. We saw them rise. We fought back. We won some battles. We lost more. And in every shattered city and broken Jaeger shell, they gained something precious, data. And they're not done. The breach may seem sealed, but it pulses beneath us like a wound that hasn't finished bleeding. So tonight, as you lie in bed, staring into the quiet, ask yourself, what if the real invasion is still unfolding, just beneath your feet? Keep your eyes on the water. And remember, if the sky starts to hum, and the sea goes still, and the machines begin to whisper in unfamiliar voices, it means the Kaiju have remembered your name.